All right. So my name is Laura Baker. Hello, everyone. I am the operations manager with the League of Women Voters of Colorado. It is a pleasure to be here with all of you. We are co-hosting this workshop with the Zonta Club of Denver, which was, I see some hand clapping, that's awesome. The Zonta Club of Denver was formed in 1927 and is part of Zonta International, which engages members in philanthropy, scholarships, social activities, fundraising, all to empower women through service and advocacy. Amazing. They have a million different things they're working on all the time. The longest running service project of the group, from what I understand, was a sponsorship of the Denver Girls, which was a partnership with Denver Public Schools that matched middle school and high school girls, at-risk girls, with counselors and mentors and that kind of thing. Something really important that I think everyone can benefit from. So if you want some more information about the Zonta Club of Denver, if you want to support them or just want some more information in general or get in touch with them, if you want to get involved, you can go to www.zontadenver.org. Zonta, just to be clear, is ZONTA Denver.org. So definitely go check that out. And they're hosting with us, the League of Women Voters of Colorado. You may or may not be familiar with us. I would think most of you probably are. Been around for over 100 years, working to just get as many people as possible, women in particular, of course, engaged in the political process through engagement, voting, maybe running for office. That's a lot of our realm, but we just are always working to get people engaged with the political process through voting primarily. So now to the exciting part that we all came for. So we are lucky enough to be joined by Martín Carcasson today. He's joining us to lead this workshop as a professor in the Communication Studies Department of Colorado State University. He is the founder and director of the CSU Center for Public Deliberation, or CPD. And he's faculty in the CSU new Masters in Public Policy and Admin program, administration. From 2016 to 2021, so until just recently, Carcasson served as the chair for the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation. And he was on the board of directors. Is that right, Martín?
Yeah, I was the chair of the board of governors.
Got it. Okay, cool. Thank you for clarifying that for me. His research that he does primarily focuses on helping local communities address what he calls wicked problems, which I'm sure he'll expand upon, more productively through improved public communication, community problem solving, and collaborative decision making, which is incredible. So this session that he's going to be doing with us today focuses on how to better engage diverse publics on difficult issues. So communities that don't necessarily look like each other can talk about these harder things that we all deal with. So he's particularly considering the current level of polarization and hyper-partisanship that is evident in our world right now, that we all experience every day. So this workshop utilizes the concepts of wicked problems as a useful framework for reframing complex issues in a way that opens up space for us to have more nuanced conversations. Participants, all of us, will learn in this workshop about recent research in social psychology that shows why many of our current traditional public processes unfortunately work to bring out the worst in participants, inherently undermining our ability to address difficult issues and causing more distrust and frustration and just general cynicism. deliberative engagement processes, such as those used by CSU's Center for Public Deliberation that Martín is head of, will be introduced in this workshop as alternatives that both avoid triggering the worst in human nature, which we all have seen, as well as work to tap into key positive aspects that can be critical to all of us sharing in healthy local public culture. So Martín, thank you so much for being here with us. I'm super excited. I think this is going to be great. Thank you everybody for being here, and Martín, take it away.
Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you for the organizations kind of for sponsoring this. It's never hard to get me talking about this kind of work. And it's always exciting to see so many people interested in finding out better ways for us to have the conversations that we need to have for democracy to work. If you haven't looked at the chat, I posted a few things on the chat. Laura might repost them. I think we might have had a few people kind of come in. I have, there's a lot of slides. I won't probably cover them all, right? A lot of the slides are just, depending on Q&A for me to kind of bounce into some other things. But I posted a link of the PDF of all the slides. Some of the slides have a lot of content. I might not cover all of that today, but if you're wanting to go back and dig in, all the slides are numbered. So if you've got a question, or if you want to me afterwards, you can say, hey, on slide 52 or whatever. And then I also just created a shared Google Doc page that I just posted a whole bunch of links, including to the PDF and some other articles I've written, but also during the presentation, I'll mention a few other kind of TED Talks that I really like, type of things. And so make it a little bit easier for you to track it down if you want to kind of further on, right? I see a lot of familiar faces. I know a lot of y'all have heard me talk before. This is another version of a basic talk I've probably given literally, imagine I'm in the 200s now over the last 15 years kind of running the center. It constantly adapts. There'll be, there's new slides in here that I know no one's seen, but if you've seen it the last couple of years or so, a lot of this might be the same. But I also, everyone tells me I talk really fast, and listening to me talk is like drinking water from a fire hose. So sometimes the second or third time, it's a little bit more relaxing, and you can really think about some things. The format for today, I'm going to be talking a lot. I'm going to, because basically what I'm doing today is kind of like the basic software, the big picture theory about wicked problems and about deliberative engagement, kind of making this argument for how do we need to change how we talk to each other, right? So for at least about the first hour or so, I'm going to be covering kind of content. There'll be some chances for interaction and so forth, but and I'll use the poll everywhere for some kind of quick polls, but then I'll leave it probably about 20 minutes in to a Q&A function that people can put questions in there. You can see each other's questions. You can thumbs up or thumbs down a question. So we can kind of collect questions as I'm going. Then about an hour or so in, depending on how many stories I decide to tell, we'll have a break to really kind of dig into some of those questions and see. I have a lot more material if you look at the PDF. That kind of depends on the questions and depends on where we go that I might kind of jump into. So like more specific kind of tools to dig into. So first half is going to be more big picture theory. And then the second half is going to be more discussion, Q&A, and then maybe diving back into the slide deck to talk about some specific tools based on kind of y'all's interest, right? I do hope, like I always say, that this is a beginning of a conversation. And I would like maybe if people could put, because I know we got obviously most of us are from Colorado, but we also posted this on my social media and the CBD social media, and I see some folks from Florida and some other places. So maybe people are willing to kind of put, where are you coming from, right? What town and what state? So it'd be nice to kind of get a sense in the chat of everyone in this call. To add a little bit to my bio, just to kind of contextualize things. So basically for the last 20 years of my life, I have focused on how do we talk about tough issues. My initial academic background is in argumentation, right? So it's like, how do people make arguments? How do people defend their perspective? What reasons do people give for what they believe or what they want or what they're selling or what they're trying to convince us to do? The traditional kind of field of argumentation is all about logic and evidence and credibility and the quality of your source and those type of things. So I really dug into there. But there's also this realization that I made probably about 20 years ago that we're not exactly logical creatures, right? So the fact that an argument might be more logical or might technically be a stronger argument from an academic perspective does not necessarily mean it's an actual effective argument. And actually, you'll get a good sense of this today. It often means the opposite, right? It's a lot easier to manipulate, and a good argument doesn't have that much of advantage, other than the fact that an argument kind of based on facts and reality tends to have longevity, right? Facts kind of keep on coming back, but it doesn't necessarily have a persuasive advantage. So I started kind of adapting my work. I teach classes in persuasion. I teach classes in social movements. So I started digging a lot more into, how do people use values to persuade us, or often, unfortunately, to manipulate us? How do people use stories and narratives? How do people use emotions? And all of that was within this broader context of me trying to figure out, how do we have the conversations we need to have to address our shared problems better, that honor democracy, that honor diversity, that honor the need to kind of move forward and to deal with issues and things that we really kind of care about, right? My initial work in grad school at Texas A&M was much more focused on the national level. My dissertation focused on how presidents from Johnson to Clinton talked about welfare and poverty issues. Part of my work has always been really interested in the tension between kind of democracy and expertise, and what's the role of experts in society, and what's the role of the public. And my quick view of that is we're in trouble if either one of those dominate too much, right? If the public dominates and we dismiss experts, we can get to mob rule pretty quickly. But if we let experts make all the decisions for us, we're not an actual democracy, right? So democracy is always about keeping those two things in tensions and recognizing that we need both, and we need better proactive ways to weave them together. And you'll kind of see that throughout my presentation. When I finished up at A&M and I came to Fort Collins, this was in 2003, I shifted my work from a national perspective to a local, primarily for my own mental health, right? The national two-party politics was just too frustrating to kind of figure out, right? My passion was helping people elevate our conversations and focusing on the national level. Thinking at that time to focus on that for my next 30, 40 years didn't seem very fun. So I switched to the local level of where I think, hey, at the local area, we can make a difference. We can build capacity and have very different kind of conversations. And then I also shifted from being much more of an academic, like a critic, talking about other people's communication, to being much more of a practitioner. Or the fancy words for me now is a pracademic, right? I am an academic. I'm a tenured professor. I've got to write papers and write books, but I also do a lot of my work in the community. And so I started the CBD now 16 years ago as this impartial resource to the Northern Colorado community. As was mentioned in the bio, I train undergraduate students as facilitators in dedicated classes. And then we run events for the city of Fort Collins, for Larimer County, for the League of Women Voters, for nonprofits, for the United Way, and for the university, school district, and so forth, and all based on these ideas that I'll share today. Going back again to that, democracy requires pretty high quality communication. We have to be able to talk to each other, right? And unfortunately, that doesn't happen naturally, right? So with that, I guess one more quick thing I'll do before I jump into the slide deck. I'll make the argument. I've been making this argument for 5 years, and it seemed somewhat profound 5 years ago. Now it might seem kind of obvious. I think the number one issue that we're facing is the inability to talk to each other. The kind of hyperpolarization and outrage it basically undermines any other issue in some important ways. And yes, we have a lot of other issues. We've got inequality. We've got climate change. A lot of issues that I know people in the call care about. But I truly believe if we don't move the needle on figuring out how to talk to each other, we're not going to be able to take on those issues, right? The good news is once we do start figuring out how to talk to each other, we'll be able to deal with all those issues better, right? So again, my focus is how do we shift how we talk about things. In particular, you'll get a clear sense of how do we design processes and engage each other in ways that rather than triggering the worst in human nature, which I will argue most of our processes do now, actually avoid that and actually tap into the best of human nature, which we need, right? So today's presentation, the workshop, is going to be a bit of a roller coaster, right? It's going to get a little dark and a little depressing about midway through. So hopefully you don't have to leave in the middle, right? If you do, email me, I'll send you the last part of it. But we'll hopefully end on a pretty hopeful note. As scary as things are right now with our democracy and really global democracy, we do know better ways of doing things, and there's more and more examples of individual communities figuring it out, and turning what I'll talk about, this negative feedback loop of polarization, into a much more positive, virtuous cycle of authentic engagement, right? So with that, let me pull up my slide deck. And again, you have this whole deck. You got my email there. I'm happy to continue the conversation. One of the links that I have in that resource page that I shared is to a Google workshop folder. So I give lots of longer all-day workshops. This is it's not quite a workshop when I only have 2 hours, I guess, in some ways, but have a lot of examples of my articles, other articles, examples of materials the CPD has produced. I'll talk a little bit later about the importance of discussion guides, and so it's just something to kind of explore. And you could also kind of pop your email in there if you want, when I update that, when I add kind of new things in there, just to kind of help you continue the conversation, right? I like to pull this up at the beginning to once again show you I'm not just the academic coming down from the ivory tower to tell y'all how you should do democracy. Everything I talk about today has really been built from practice. Built from events that we work on in the community, learning how to engage real people on real issues. The other thing about this list, and I've had to take a lot of things off of this list, and the font's getting pretty small as we keep on going. Basically, every single bullet point on this list was the community coming to us saying, we need to talk about this issue better, right? And that's a part of the hopeful message I'll send today, that as polarized as we are, as frustrated as we are, when we give people an alternative, when we give them a different way of talking to each other, they recognize the value of it. They seek it out. And the one thing that's continuously happened with CPD events is at the end of the event, people walk up to me pretty weary. We got their brains working in a different way. We made them think differently. It was hard, but they recognize the value of it. Walk up to me and they say, we need to do this on this issue, right? And people start demanding more, right? This is, do I have it? This is what one of my events look like. Well, at least pre-COVID, right? Now they're in Zoom rooms for a while. We actually talked today about potentially having an in-person event in April for the county. So we'll see if that happens. But 100 people show up, and instead of 100 people listening to a group of experts on the stage, or even worse, 100 people walking up to that microphone one at a time, we can split them up into 15 different tables. The young lady on the left in blue is one of my students. Next to another student, trained as a facilitator, generally trained as a facilitator, but also trained specifically on that event, on that topic, to help people have the kind of conversation. So then rather than just having a public input process that we're just hearing a lot of individual opinions one by one, talking past each other, we actually have a conversation. We interact with each other. We engage each other. We like to think about our processes, our truly public engagement processes, or even like a public learning process. Because we come up with new ideas and we change people's opinions. We don't just collect people's opinions, we refine their opinions. We elevate the conversation, right? And that's what we need for a public process, right? So if you're able to jump on that poll everywhere link, right? Hopefully it's still kind of going. A few of y'all have gotten in there. Feel free to go back on the chat. I think someone had just posted it. Yeah, that pollev.com. You click that, you don't have to put your name. You can press skip right under the name box if you want to kind of jump in on this. You see a few more people are kind of voting. You don't have to. You'll see the results here. It's just kind of to give a sense of it. But I've been asking this question now probably for the last 8 years or so, right? And y'all can see the results on there. If you didn't notice, there's a mix of negative words and positive words on this list, asking people, like, which of these three kind of best describe the current quality. I do assume that if I ask this question, like local versus national, we might get a very different answer. Though in some very scary ways, a lot of the the hyper partisanship from the national level has come to the local level, particularly with COVID, particularly with school boards lately. And that's a dangerous thing that we really need to think about, right? But as I've been asking this question for the last few years, what you see is what I've typically seen, which is, typically every single negative question gets picked before any of the positives. And so we have a couple of positives up on the top. But obviously polarized, the number one answer here, dominated by a few loud voices. The second, mean-spirited, simplistic. This chart in a way shows you the work that I try to do, which is to change this, right? And really, as we think about changing this, there's really kind of two steps to this. One is doing things to avoid sparking the negative things. And I'll make the argument that unfortunately, much of the public process will rely on the normal ways of engaging the public on issues, unfortunately bring out the mean-spiritedness, the polarization. They reward simple stories. They allow themselves to be dominated by a few loud voices, right? So the first step is doing things that don't bring out the worst in us. And then second step, even better, is to replace those things with things that actually tap into the positive terms, right? The productive, the high quality, informed. I probably should add, I talk a lot more about creativity and curiosity now, but if I change it, then my data set from the last 15 years gets mixed up, right? So we'll be thinking about this kind of as we go forward, right? So what I'm going to try to do here for the next hour, and I've already kind of talked to myself we're 25 minutes in, okay. See how it goes quick. So I'm going to make three kind of big key arguments, right? First, I'm going to talk about this concept of wicked problems. And I know a lot of y'all have heard me before. I've heard of this before. But for me, wicked problems is this really kind of useful concept, a way of thinking almost, to help us think about tough issues in a different way, right? So first, I'm going to talk about what I mean by that and make the case, make an argument that I will try to back up with reasonable arguments on why this is a particularly useful way to see the world, right? Then the dark part will come, right? So I'll summarize some research that I did now about 3 or 4 years ago. I did a deep dive into brain science and social psychology, really to understand, why with the few projects that we did that were particularly polarized, if we got people in the room, we could have a good conversation, but we weren't able to change the broader conversation in the community, right? We had a particular issue. If you're familiar with CSU, it was about the building of this new stadium that just kind of polarized the community and really struggled and really divided people. There's still some wounds there. So that kind of sent me to the literature and the research to try to understand why did people polarize so quickly and why was it so hard for people to get off that, right? And a lot of what I learned from that research, unfortunately, was bad news. I learned that our brains are very much more wired for polarization and outrage than they are for deliberation or collaboration, right? So this middle part, I'll walk through the bad news. Another way of thinking about this middle part is answering the question, why are we so polarized, right? Why are things so bad now? How do we understand that so then we're better equipped to address it in some important ways? But then, as promised, I'll end with a much more hopeful news, right? And I'll tell you that, when I started this work, I'm a very optimistic guy. I'm someone that needs to kind of have a lot of hope and impact in the work that I do. And that's why I made that shift from national politics to local 15 years ago. And 15 years later, after doing this work, I can tell you that I'm actually more optimistic, right? As scary as some of the national things, right? I have more and more faith when you engage people better. They have the capability of having the conversations we need to have. I know some people, I'm looking at Margaret Holt in particular, who's been doing this work for a while. I imagine they'll agree with me, those that engage the people with different ways, that there's a lot of hopefulness of it. Each time we run an event, we realize that we just need to do more of this, right? So we'll end with that, and then we'll start getting into some of the tools of how we do this. Both individual tools. So a lot of today is individually how you can kind of build your own toolkit, but also recognizing that changing individual behavior is not going to be enough, right? If you're one deliberative person in a polarized storm, you're not going to function very well, right? So while we individually need to change how we engage people and learn and build these skills, we also all have to work together to change our processes. particularly at the local level, to think about how we engage people differently, to hopefully once again, develop these processes that avoid triggering the worst in human nature and actually help us tap in to what I'll talk about, the other side of the research, the good news of some really hopeful things that I found about human nature that we can tap into with good process, right? So with that, let's jump into kind of wicked problems. There's a whole literature on this, and anything I talk about in here, right? If you want to dig in a little bit more, I'm happy to kind of send you some more articles or things like that. But overall, this idea here, the literature on wicked problems tends to talk more about wicked problems as a type of problem. Some of y'all might be familiar with Ronald Hyphen's adaptive leadership. He talks about type 1, type 2, type 3 problems. Some people talk about simple, complex, and wicked, right? Those are useful. But I like to think about wicked problems more as a lens through which to see problems. So a tool in your toolkit that you'll have here in a little bit, that you can step back and say, if I look at this as a wicked problem, how does that change the conversation? How does that open up space for us to talk about things a little bit differently, right? So the basic definition you see on the top here, wicked problems, you're primarily really looking at the underlining values, paradoxes, and trade-offs that just don't fit together. But the easiest way to really explain this is through an example. So I've been using this one. This will be familiar if anyone's heard me speak before, because this is just a good one to kind of start with, right? This is actually a slide that we used in a project now probably about 12 years ago here in Fort Collins. Water is a wicked problem in northern Colorado. We don't get enough water, right? It doesn't rain enough for us to have the agricultural community that we built up. We get a lot of rain in May and June because all the snow melts and the rivers all of a sudden are raging. So for the last 100 years, we built reservoirs and ditches to capture a lot of that water. We built pipelines to the other side of the mountains to get more water. But it's becoming a more and more of a wicked issue because more and more people want that water for different things. It's a wonderful place to live. More and more people moving here that need water for their houses and their lawns. But then we're also realizing that we're probably overworking the river. As we learn more about hydrology and river health. So more people want to leave water in the river. So we were actually asked by the CSU Water Institute, so kind of the experts, and the Community Foundation of Northern Colorado, kind of the community, to say, we need to learn how to talk about water better in Northern Colorado, because this can become more and more of an issue. And if we just kind of keep on talking past each other and assuming the worst of each other and yelling at each other, it's just going to get worse and worse. So we started this project, and I created, this is one of the tools that I use. I call these my wicked problem slides. And it's my job as a deliberative practitioner. I listen to a lot of the noise, right? I go to the different websites. I go to city council when they're lined up one at a time at the microphone. I read all the comments in the newspaper. I have this love-hate relationship with message boards, right? They're so painful to read, right? People talking past each other, making simple assumptions, but me reading it to try to understand what matters to people. What do people care about, right? You start pulling these things out, right? This one also, we had an initial event that 300 people showed up to. That we had these little half sheets of paper asking people, hey, what's important to you when you think about the river? What concerns do you have about the future of the river, right? I always want to ask open-ended questions because I want people to make arguments. I want people, I don't care as much about what position they have. I want to know the reasons for their position. Because as I analyze that, is that we get people talking about what they're concerned about, what they're scared about, what they hope, what they really want. Inherently, they're talking about their values, right? And a lot of my work is, from the argumentation perspective, to identify the values that are important to people, pull them out, put them on the table, and then help people think through that, right? So this slide shows a wicked problem in a couple different ways. One, if you look at these things one at a time, none of these things are bad, right? I'm not saying they're all equally good. And actually, I'll directly say they're not equally good, right? But people would certainly prioritize these differently. But the biggest part of this that makes it a wicked problem is these 9 things don't fit together very well, right? And the more that we focus on some of these, the harder it is to focus on others. The conversations we need to be having in our community is how do we negotiate those tensions, right? How do we find better ways? So I've been talking lately, this might be new for some of y'all, of these 3 conversations that we need to have, right? Long term, we need to have this balancing conversation. How do we find the right balance between these as we're kind of going through? We're never going to solve this. We're never going to come up with the perfect way to deal with water in Northern Colorado, right? Because it's constantly about these underlying values, and circumstances kind of constantly change. So we're in this process of constantly balancing and kind of tweaking and trying to get that kind of ideal equilibrium in a way. Short term, we'll have this, what I'm calling recalibrating conversation. We might have some pretty big shifts. We might realize that one value is dominating too much, or maybe one value has been left behind, or maybe there's a brand new value we haven't thought of before that we need to kind of consider. So to be able to get back in balance, we need a big shift. And this is important because I know a lot of y'all probably see yourselves a little bit more as activists, right? Deliberation isn't about, avoiding activism, right? It's about being more pragmatic about activism. So this recalibrating kind of conversation opens up space for people to have very strong opinions about things that need to change, right? That we need to shift. But what I want people to avoid is, well, let me finish this, I'll get back to that. The third conversation is this transcending conversation. This in some ways is the ideal, but not always possible. And that's when we find ways of transcending the tension. We find ways to win-win. We find ways to be able to do both, right? But the reality is having this balancing conversation, or this recalibrating conversation, or the transcending conversation isn't natural to us. What our brains prefer, what most of our public processes reward, is a much simple conversation, which is taking one of these value at a time and framing things as if I'm for a good thing, therefore anyone that disagrees with me rejects a good thing. Our brains love defining the people that we disagree with by what they're against rather than what they're for, right? Because that fits this simple narrative, this good versus evil story that humans are just ingrained with, that we'll get into here in a little bit, right? So a lot of our work is, okay, how do we frame processes to not let people frame things as if only one value is relevant, right? Professional persuaders, manipulators, conflict entrepreneurs is one of my new favorite terms. Amanda Ripley kind of came up with that. Want to narrow the frame and say it's only about one thing in a simple kind of deductive logic in a way. My job as a deliberative practitioner is to back up and say, there's lots of values here. They don't fit together very well. How do we identify those values, put them on the table, recognize the tension, and then put people in a situation that they can work through those tensions? So here are a few other examples. We actually did this one out at Steamboat Springs with the extension agent out there that really wanting to build up a local food economy. Once again, each of these one at a time are good things. They just don't fit together very well, right? So how do we talk about those tensions? How do we kind of work together across these? Healthcare, and a lot of y'all I know care a lot about healthcare. I've done a lot of work over the years with League of Women Voters on healthcare. Can be very complex, but another way of thinking about it is we want those 3 things, and they don't fit together very well, right? So how do we negotiate those tensions? How do we work together to find ways of transcending those tensions? This is a process that we ran in Fort Collins. Probably about 6 or 7 years ago. Downtown Fort Collins, a wonderful place, but it's also, different people want it for different things, right? So we had about 3,000 surveys filled out asking people what they want out of Fort Collins and how do we deal with kind of some of these tensions. And again, these are the underlying values came out, and then we had this process asking people, hey, which of these are most important to you, and which of these are new, and having people share and have these conversations, and really kind of had a really robust conversation of what we want downtown to be. And we don't want any of these to win, right? We got to recognize that all of these have some value as we go through. If we have any CSU fans, I was asked to help with parking, and I remember my initial response was, parking seems like a very technical issue, right? Just find a parking expert to design it. But they convinced me at least to do an initial survey. So we did a survey and got it out. And even though there's survey fatigue, no one wants to answer surveys anymore, we got tons of responses pretty quickly, right? And again, I ask open-ended questions. We see how people talk about it, and all these values come tumbling out, right? So it's probably one of my most complex wicked problem slides is as we think about what's fair and what's right for parking at a university, all these different factors kind of come in, right? This is one of my favorite ones to really kind of think, particularly is the best example of that transcendent option in a way, right? Fort Collins is officially known as a triple bottom line city. That means every major policy goes through the lens of What's the impact on people? What's the impact on the planet? And what's the impact on the economy, right? And there's an interesting background here because single bottom line is profit, right? For corporations, they have a bottom line, and their job is to kind of produce profits for their stockholders and so forth, right? Triple bottom line was actually developed in I think the late 70s or so by environmental activists that realized that at that point, and still in a lot of ways, there was kind of the environment versus the economy as kind of an adversarial kind of process. And a group of environmentalists kind of realized if that stays the frame, we're probably going to lose because they have a lot more money and power than us, right? So they reframed it in a way. And part of this reframing is, hey, let's not demonize profit. Well, let's not say caring about the economy and good jobs and so forth and rewarding hard work. Let's not say that's a bad thing, right? But let's say, hey, it's one of three things that's important, and we need to find ways of finding a better balance with that, right? And certainly the environmentalists were probably arguing for a recalibration that the environment needs to be considered more within this. But most importantly, and this is huge for Northern Colorado and for CSU, we care a lot about green jobs. And a well-paying green job is great for the economy, it's great for the environment, and it's great for people. And all of a sudden, past adversaries that were kind of demonizing each other and attacking each other and polarizing, all of a sudden are working together because we've transcended that tension and we've created a win-win, right? So that's kind of another example of how you kind of reframe things. This is a newer one, obviously. I think I developed it last summer, way too late. If I developed it really early, it'd be interesting if we would have been able to change some of these conversations, right? But this one looks a little different because public health is centered and a larger font in the middle of the page, right? So I'm implying directly from the beginning of this that as we think about COVID, and one thing I'll say here is COVID itself, it probably isn't a wicked problem. We have a vaccine now. We know technically how to stop COVID. How communities respond to COVID gets wicked pretty quickly, right? Because as we look at how do we respond as we think about mandates or vaccines or or requirements and so forth, it runs into some of these other values, right? But the human nature is we want to frame things in simple ways, right? So, if you're for mandates and so forth, you're like, I care about the public health, right? I care about people. People that disagree with me, well, they're just ridiculous, or they're heartless, or they don't care about grandma, or what you saw, and I saw all kinds of editorial cartoons and memes making fun of people, right? Well, as we get into human nature, making fun of people doesn't work very well, right? It doesn't tend to persuade them. It tends to kind of lead them to dig in a way. But if we would have started from the beginning of saying we have to prioritize public health, but let's take these other concerns seriously. And how do we implement policies that we need to implement because of this current crisis? But how do we do it in the way that tries to mitigate at least as much as possible, or at least recognize these other values that are unfortunately going to, that have an inherent tension with some of the things that we're doing in public health. How different of a conversation might we have had if we started from that in a way, right? Last point I'll make is a preamble to the Constitution. Embedded in the preamble are some pretty big values that we're hoping for. And I love the phrasing here, the notion of to form a more perfect union, right? It's this recognition that we're never going to perfect this. We're never going to get this all right, right? But the United States is in democracy itself is always just striving to find a better way of balancing these values that we care about, right? But if we translate those values into a little bit more modern terms, here are 5 big American values: justice and security and equality, freedom for us and freedom for future generations. Well, the point here that I'm making is democracy itself, American values, are wicked, right? If you take these one at a time, these are all good things. If I'm trying to persuade you from my side, I want to pick one of these and say, hey, I care about equality, right? So if you care about equality, you support me. If you don't support me, well, then you're inherently un-American, right? And again, that fits that simple narrative in a way. But the reality is each of these one at a time are great, right? Especially when we don't define it, right? When we don't say what we mean by this. These are powerful, in the academic literature, they're called God terms, or these powerful premises of persuasion that support so many different arguments when we're not kind of thinking in a nuanced way. But the reality is these don't fit together very well, right? So we're gonna go back to poll everywhere if you still have it up, or if you can kind of post the link again, Laura, real quick. It should kind of go to this one. We'll do another quick little exercise here, which I've been doing this one for 15 years, so it's always fascinating to kind of see. But if you had to pick one of these to be most important to you, right? And if we had a lot more time, my all-day workshops, we try to spend a little bit of time with this, getting out some pens and paper and asking people to, like, what do you mean by these? How do you define these terms? Can get pretty interesting as we kind of go through, right? But, for what the word means to you, if you had to kind of pick one of these to be kind of most powerful, most important to you, what would you pick, right? So you see the answers kind of coming in. As I said, I've asked this question probably for 20 years or now. A lot of the classes I teach, all the talks I give like this, and I could tell you, this was actually interesting. Justice is normally not number one. Justice is, personally what I would answer because of my particular definition of justice and how I see it. But what you do see here on the screen is every single one of them got picked by at least one person, right? Which is almost always what happened. If I have at least like 15 people in the room, in a sense, right, I generally always have at least one person picks every single one as you look here, right? We have a little bit more focus on justice and equality here, but at least a few people on the other ones, right? Hopefully most people got in. I'm going to ask a little bit of a tougher question here. Which of these is least important to you? Which of these are you most willing to kind of give up, right? This one always takes a little bit longer, right? As you kind of go through this is one of the reasons I don't ask for your name, right? This is completely anonymous, right? If you decide to run for office, or for some of you run for office again, right? I won't be able to kind of use this in an attack ad, right? That, but generally, if you think about these, and these answers are kind of coming in, if you feel a little bit weird answering this and looking at this, that it seems like you're saying that this value isn't important, right? That's not what I'm asking. I'm saying if you had to pick one of these that's least important, which one are you most willing to give up? It can be hard, right? But once again, we already have, which is, I'm not sure exactly how many of y'all have answered, but we already have every single one of them got picked by at least one person in the room, right? Part of what I do with this is part of the argument from a wicked problems perspective and a deliberative perspective is, in a lot of ways, we all have the same values. What makes this different is how we rank those values, right? And which ones are important. And this is ranking kind of abstractly, right? Even harder is in real life when these values are pitted against each other, which one wins, right? Which one kind of dominates in a sense. Part of a wicked problems perspective is we're dealing with the tensions between these values all the time, right? If we longer workshops, we really kind of dig into this a little bit, but just looking at those 5 values, there's some pretty big tensions, right? That naturally kind of come out. Maybe not an automatic zero sum, they're opposites, right? But generally, if we try to focus on one of those values, it makes it a little bit harder to focus on some of the other ones, right? Equality is also a really interesting term, probably for maybe just like the last 5 years or so. All of a sudden, a lot of y'all probably seen the memes about equality and equity, and this new term equity, particularly people working with school districts, but also now I do a lot of work with city managers and local officials and so forth. So a lot of work on equity is this new value, often distinguished, connected to equality in some ways, but also kind of distinguished from it. These are big conversations we need to have, because these are powerful words. They're contested terms. People mean different things by them, but we don't inherently have these conversations. But we use these words almost as weapons. We use these words as ways of often mobilizing our side, but also inherently kind of creating divisions, right? So a lot of my work now, some recent writing that I've really been doing, is really thinking about how do we have better conversations about values. We don't tend to do that automatically. Values are often kind of implied in when we talk. We don't say I care about security, therefore, right? We don't speak in logical syllogisms, right? But we make claims about things that we care about, and again, inherently they bring out these values that we need to talk about. But our brain is much more in tune to talking about one value at a time versus recognizing the tensions between them. So the work that we try to do, again, is identify those values, put them on the table, and help people have the tough conversations about negotiating those of balancing them in long term, recalibrating them as needed to change things and to challenge status quo when it's not right, but then also hopefully kind of transcending, right? These are just some of the other tensions. I've kind of retrained my brain, and I'll admit sometimes it's dangerously close to I've got a hammer and everything looks like a nail, right? But a lot of my work is looking for the tensions. When I start a new project and have conversations with people, I'm looking for what are people not talking about that's really the heart of this issue, right? And then how do we find ways to productively frame that and help people have that conversation? On the short term, you can frame things strategically, you can avoid the tension, you could probably get a fast start and get people motivated and going. At some point, that tension is going to blow things up. Right. So for me, is if we start with the tension and recognize that and design process to help deal with that, I think we're going to move the needle on the issues that we care about a lot more. Right? So with that, the best way for us to deal with wicked problems is to dealing with wicked problems requires us to have some tough conversations, requires us to talk across perspectives, really asks us to tap into human creativity. But if you go back to the first question I asked you about what words do you use to describe the quality of public discourse, we didn't get any of those words, right? We got a lot of negative words. So for us to be able to deal with wicked problems the way we need to deal with, we really need to change the way we talk about issues, right? So that's the first part. Okay, I need to start going a little faster. So now we're going to kind of get into bad news. If this next, I'm going to try to do this pretty quickly because I want to kind of get to the good news, and then I also want to get to just some Q&A and some specific kind of tools, right? So I'll go pretty fast here. If you want more details of this, I can kind of send you some stuff. I got about a 60-page report that I can send you that really digs into the weeds if you want to. I also got a 5-page summary, but then I also have videos of me going a little slower than I will now, right? But this is this research that I did about 5 years ago, really digging into the new research in psychology and brain science to really understand why we're so divided, right? These are just some of the books. If you're a book person, you're going to want to order about 10 books after my presentation. So I apologize for that if that's a problem. I love some of these titles. This one won a Nobel Prize that we're really wired to think fast. We don't want to think. That they use the term cognitive misers, right? But we do have the ability to think slow. Right. So how do we shift people from the default fast thinking to slow thinking when we need them to work through a tough issue? Why you're not smart and 46 other ways you're deluding yourself, why your brain distorts and deceives. My favorite title is what makes your brain happy and why you should do the opposite. Jonathan Haidt's work is really interesting, particularly looking at the moral foundations, the values inherent to progressives and conservatives, and how do we understand each other better to hopefully find better ways of working together. This is a classic text, I think, written in the mid-90s about why misinformation sticks around, why it's so hard to get people off facts that misinformation or disinformation that's really exploded here in the last few years. This is a newer version of that, of looking at the death of expertise and how are we dealing with things like the post-fact society and so forth. The paper I wrote gets in, had a couple hundred articles, journal articles, academic articles digging into that. I also have a file now that's probably not this big of newer stuff since then that I need to get back to and kind of refine some of these things. But of all that work, here's some big themes that I learned that we really need to kind of understand as we try to deal with these issues and elevate our conversations. So first is our brains are wired to crave certainty and consistency. Once we make a decision, our brain is wired to protect that decision and defend that decision and to seek out confirmation of that decision and to avoid or attack or reject anyone trying to change our mind in a sense, right? Second, we're very much, I said earlier that we're not logical creatures, we're not rational creatures. The initial argumentation theory that I learned is great for a classroom, but doesn't quite apply into the real world in some important ways because we're much more narrative creatures. We think in terms of story. We interpret information in terms of story. We store it in terms of story. And this basic story of good versus evil with a hero and a villain and a victim is just ingrained in us. It's like an archetype. It's a kind of anthropological fact across all cultures, across all times that we think like this. And once we've decided on the story, on the narrative, we see the world through that lens. Once we decide who's the villain, everything the villain does is interpreted through that lens. And what would a villain do? And same thing with the heroes on our side, right? And that really influences. I have this. This is the Disney villains kind of picture, right? I've got 3 kiddos. I've watched lots of Disney movies, and I realized as I started doing this work, how much we were training our kids. This is why Disney makes so much money, right? Because it gives our brain exactly what we want, a simple good versus evil story. And if you look at these villains, they're just evil, right? They're not misunderstood, right? They don't have other motives, right? They just wanted power. And they know the perfect formula for the movie, that evil's winning in the middle. So we get really anxious and nervous, but then good makes a comeback and vanquishes evil, and we live happily ever after. And we love it. And we want to watch it over and over and over again. And we're training our kids from a really young age. If there's ever a tough problem, look for the villain, right? We're teaching them that problems are caused by wicked people rather than the wickedness being in the problem, right? And we're reifying and strengthening the negative aspects of human nature that want the simple story, right? Third, we're groupish. In the popular culture, we use the word tribal a lot, political tribalism. There's a whole bunch of new books lately about that. Tribal, I think, is a much more complex term for my Native American friends. I'd rather not just kind of have such a negative connotation on that. Jonathan Haidt uses the word groupish, which I like, because partly what that tells us is, as a species, we're not actually that selfish. We're designed to be in groups. We're designed to be social. We're designed to be in teams from the very beginning. We're not individualistic. We'll get back to this later, because this is one of those things that's 2 sides of this coin. Unfortunately, some of the worst things that humans have ever done is because of this. We have a powerful inclination to make distinctions between us and them. And some of the worst things we've done is when we've demonized them, we dehumanized them, and justified horrible things to them. Later on, we'll come back to this, because there's the positive side of this is, as we've expanded the us, as we shift who's the us versus them, there's a lot of positive potential to, so there's this basic aspect of human nature, of our social, how we're set up, our groupishness is something that bad actors can take advantage of to manipulate us. But good actors can also take advantage to help bring us together in some important ways. The reality is who's the us and who's the them is not real, right? We decide that. That means we can change that, and we can reshift that. One quick example, when I shifted my work from national politics to local, a big part of it was, well, national politics, it was all about us and you're the red team or the blue team, right? Whereas local politics, maybe the us is Fort Collins, right? Maybe we start with something that brings us together rather than something that inherently divides us, right? And if we're able to kind of capture enough of common ground of what connects us, then we can deal with the differences a lot better, right? We don't want to erase the differences, right? Differences are part of democracy, certainly part of living in a diverse kind of plural society, right? But we need to recognize enough of the common ground that allows us, that equips us to deal with the differences in more productive ways, right? And the fourth one, which is particularly important to me as an argumentation scholar, is our brains, because of those first 3 things, we're really bad at dealing with evidence and how we kind of make sense of the world, right? We're bad reasoners. The ideal that I teach in my a lower level argumentation and reasoning class, unfortunately, is not how we work naturally, right? We can develop those habits. So this part was a big part of my research. So in the paper, I'm going to do this real quick, but in the paper, I dig into all these stages. But these stages of motivated reasoning is this notion that we're motivated to think in a certain way. And unfortunately, we're primarily motivated to protect our position, right? We're motivated to protect our team. We like to think that we're motivated for accuracy or for truth or for goodness, and not quite, right? At least the natural tendency in a way. So these stages are actually chronological stages that build on each other. When I started doing this research 5 years ago, a lot of the terms that you'll see on the right side of the screen were brand new to me. I imagine now most of them you'll recognize, right? The 2016 presidential campaign was motivated reasoning on steroids, right? That you just saw so many of these kind of aspects just kind of blow up on us, right? But this first stage is we're biased on even what gets to our brains, right? Who we have conversations with, where we're getting our news from. Some of us, consciously choose to get our news from Fox News or CNN or NPR or a conservative radio or so forth. Some of us don't, right? Some of us, even if we don't purposely do it, Google is constantly refining with their algorithms, right? On Facebook, if you're liking certain things, more of that, right? So you're automatically getting more and more of people that agree with you and less of people that kind of challenge you inherently, because how these kind of computers work in a sense, right? The second stage is the most important, right? So we're biased on what gets to our ears, then we're biased on how we make sense of it. And confirmation bias is probably one of the most important concepts for people to understand now. I assume many of y'all have learned about it. But confirmation bias is we're just biased to confirm what we already believe, right? We really like our priors. So when we've already made a decision, when people give us new facts, if those facts fit it, we love them, we eat them up. If those facts challenge them, we kind of reject them or kind of attack them, right? This one paragraph, this is from a couple of the books that I kind of mentioned, has really haunted me the last 5 years after doing this research, right? Because there's a lot of truth in this, that the way our brains are wired, when we want to believe something, we ask, can I believe it? And if there's just a little bit of evidence that it's true, it's like, we're done, we can stop thinking. But when we don't want to believe something, the question we ask is, must I believe this? And the rules of evidence are completely flipped, right? And we just need one good example, or not even a good example, right? That allows us to dismiss something. The power of this is huge, right? Because if I have one example of, say, the media being biased about something, right? I can then use that one example to dismiss anything the media says that I don't like, right? And there's that power. So, whenever a bad example comes, I get really, really frustrated when people on my side of a political issue argue badly, right? Because I know they're making it that much easier for people I disagree with to dismiss better arguments, right? Because in some ways, what our brains are wired to do is to always pit the best arguments on our side versus the worst arguments on their side. And that's why it seems so obvious that each side thinks that they're right and the other side is ridiculous, right? The backfire effect is a new one that really scary stuff in a sense, probably the darkest part of the day. But we're learning more. We still like to think that facts matter and the quality of the arguments matter. But the reality is, in a hyperpolarized environment, which is important, in that kind of environment, facts just don't work. And we're seeing more and more evidence that they can actually backfire. We're seeing research that if I'm trying to convince you you're wrong, in some ways, the stronger my argument, the better the sources, the clearer the statistics, the more powerful the testimony, the more you'll actually dig in. Because your brain is so wired to find a flaw in my reasoning, find something it can latch on to, that it will still find it. And after the conversation, your assumption is, okay, he, big bad PhD came with all his evidence and I still proved him wrong. And you're even more convinced that you're right and I'm wrong. The reality here, the research is showing, facts aren't going to save us. Throwing facts to the other side, throwing videos for them to watch, likely will not work, and unfortunately might even backfire and have them dig in more. Right? I'm not saying facts don't matter. We'll get back to that, right? I'm saying in a polarized environment, facts don't work the way we need them to. I won't get into these details, but additional biases on how we, so we're biased on how we interpret information, then we're biased on how we kind of remember information. We remember information in terms of story. One way to think about this is our brains are just really, really good at getting any new evidence to fit within our existing narrative, even if we have to shoehorn it in, versus allowing new evidence to challenge that narrative, right? Because how we kind of keep these things in. This was George Bush after the police officers in Dallas were ambushed probably 4 or 5 summers ago. But the way he phrased this really kind of actually captures the literature pretty well, right? Too often we judge other groups by their worst examples while judging ourselves by our best intentions. And that's going to be a big part of this work. What assumptions do you make about motives, both from your side and other sides? The power of that, the simple narrative, is we've decided someone's a villain. We make assumptions about their motives. Those assumptions color everything that they say, right? and it changes the entire conversation. Then how we make decisions are biased, and even what we remember has biases. But I'm going to try to move on there. So this all leads to this reality that this fifth kind of key summary of the research, that our brains are just really bad at value dilemmas, tensions, and tough choices, right? So we're an hour in, and I've made two big points so far. The first point is the best way to look at tough issues is to focus on the tensions and dilemmas inherent to tough issues. And the second big point I've made is our brain is really bad at that, right? So the reality is we have to build up our habits to do this. We have to find new ways of doing things so we're able to do this. Right? The last part of the bad news, so that first thing is what we do kind of individually. We build up these blinders of seeing the world in a particular way. I've been building this model of the vicious cycle of exaggerated polarization, a little quick hopefulness. We're not nearly as polarized as we think. We're not nearly as divided. All kinds of research shows this in different ways, right? Which is good news, right? The people aren't nearly as divided as it seems, or as the leaders kind of have it, right? But what is causing this more and more polarization is unfortunately a vicious cycle, a negative feedback loop. So it starts with what I just did, these individually developed subconscious bias. Then we have what's called negative interaction effects. And that's when we try to interact with people that we disagree with, that have different filters, and it goes poorly, right? On the resource page, I have a link to a nice YouTube by Catherine Schultz, who does a lot of research on how do people react when they're wrong, right? When they're told that they're wrong. The short version here is badly, right? We don't like being told that we're wrong. So she actually walks through these three stages that we first assume ignorance. They just don't know what I know, right? If they knew what I knew, they would think like me, right? But eventually that's not strong enough. So we have to upgrade to step 2, which is, okay, they're just an idiot, right? They now know what I know because I told them, but they don't understand the implications of this, right? So that we just kind of make assumptions about how bright they are. But even that, after a while, doesn't work. So she argues that we upgrade to this evil assumption. And this is that dangerous place where we make assumptions about motives, right? What our brain is really actually telling us is almost, they know I'm right. They just refuse to admit it because they're hiding their motives. Once we make that move, once we assume that people we disagree with have negative motives and they're not playing fair, communication completely breaks down. And the fact that our country right now, that basically half the country assumes that about the other half, is real danger zone in terms of how do we talk about the issues that we care about, right? Then we have what I call the Russell effect, right? Which is from this meme, which is something I'm learning more and more about. The reason we seem so polarized is often the loudest voices are the most polarized, right? And I'm not saying the loudest voices are always fools in a sense, right? But if you're so sure you're right and you're seeing the world through a simple narrative, you want to scream it from the rooftops, right? You want to walk up to that microphone. You're going to be really active on Facebook. But if you're someone that sees the nuances, that see the tensions, that see the different sides of it, and are kind of struggling, there's not really a place for you in our conversations, right? It's hard to walk up to that microphone and kind of like, I see both sides, or I'm struggling here, right? I'm trying to find a balance. Those messages just kind of seem so weak compared to people walking up saying, I am right and everyone else is wrong, right? And we, unfortunately, most of our processes reward those simple arguments and punish them. The other big part of this that I'm really adding now is, you'll see the term a little bit later, that we have this growing outrage industrial complex, right? We have a lot of people getting really, really rich, making us angry. And for me, a lot of it is they know the human nature. They've read the same research I've done, and they're weaponizing that research, right? Rather than using that research to change processes, right? They're using that research to enrich themselves, right? Or to win elections, right? And that's really what we're up against. How do we kind of change that? How do we, and I like to think that the CBD processes, the process that we run, we're able to flip that switch, right? People at our tables spousing a very simple narrative and saying, I'm right and everyone else is an idiot, seem out of place, right? They're questioned by people that are thinking out loud and kind of working through things and trying to be creative and trying to understand each other are welcomed and kind of incentivized. And that's what we need to do more and more of to kind of change what we're doing, right? Continuing with the bad news, so that's the individual interactions, but then you look at the impact of the internet, which makes things popular like this, right? That we can all be on Zoom together listening to this. But also, unfortunately, the more we learn about the impact of the internet, the more we realize it's got a lot of power to take these negative quirks of human nature and kind of blow them up, right? Makes it so easy to gather on like-minded people, so easy to cherry pick, so easy to kind of find the worst example of the other side and spread it around, right? And so all those negative aspects get expanded. And then the heart of my work kind of initially was really looking at particularly the national system. I won't walk through all these bullet points, but the reality is a two-party system with winner-take-all elections really incentivizes bad communication, right? It rewards bad arguments and punishes good ones, makes it harder. We really reward winning an argument versus actually solving a problem, and we get that so much. Now, a quick jump to the good news. At the local level, these things aren't nearly as powerful, right? So there's a lot of hope at the local level that we avoid these things. One of the basic things local communities often do is we don't use Republican and Democrat labels for local elections. I would strongly argue to try to keep that as much as possible. Strongly argue to try to keep the national political issues away from the local, because that's just going to import a lot of those negative things, right? So my research on this kind of goes through a lot of the basic processes that we use and shows how often most of these things, unfortunately, it's just bad process design, right? It's designed, unfortunately, to bring out, it tends to bring out the worst in human nature too often, right? Most of our public processes, we don't engage people until it's a yes-no issue, right? Well, if people are walking in the door and it's a yes-no issue and they've already decided that, their brains are off. Right? They're not there to think, they're not there engaged, they're not there to problem solve, right? They're there to defend their perspective. And it's just a very bad situation kind of from the beginning in a way. And the most important thing, really, the heart of what we do, so many of our public processes, particularly the one at a time of the microphone at a local issue or a public hearing or a school board meeting or a city council meeting, we have a collection of individual opinions, people talking past each other, no interaction, no engagement, no attempt at balancing or recalibrating or transcending, more just individual things talking past each other, right? And then lastly, the media, unfortunately, most of the media, this is changing. We have a great new project here in Fort Collins that the CPD helped launch with the Coloradan, our local newspaper and journalism here, called the Northern Colorado Deliberative Journalism Project, of how do we rethink journalism that infuses it. But right now, unfortunately, a lot of media, they know the human nature too. They know what sells, right? They know if it bleeds, it leads, right? They know people react to conflict. They know people want kind of heroes and victims and villains. So they tend to feed us that. They feed us what our brain wants. And that just contributes to this. And this negative cycle leads to some pretty bad places, right? That so much of our politics is just about the worst examples of the other side. We're always looking at how do we undermine, how do we make them look as bad as possible. There's a mean-spiritedness and a contempt to our politics that's something new, right? Contempt is this powerful word that kind of combines anger and disgust. We're seeing this more, it's called effective polarization. We're not more divided on issues, we're more divided just as people. We just don't like each other, right? And that fuels some really dangerous things, right? That assumption of negative motives that I mentioned, that fuels conspiracy theories, which are so hard to kind of overcome. I can tell you as a deliberative practitioner, anything I do to try to overcome a conspiracy theory can easily get enveloped into the conspiracy theory, right? That's exactly what someone predicting a conspiracy theory would say, right? So that is so corrosive to democracy in important ways. But most important to all of this is I know you're on this call because you care about things. You care about issues. There's several different things that that we need to do better. But we're so distracted by all this other stuff. We're distracted by this game of politics, by trying to win, by trying to make the other side look bad, that we never actually have the conversations we need to have to deal with those issues. Last negative slide. The rest of this is going to be good news and happiness, right? So you've made it through the dark valley, right? The last point I'll make is experts can't save us, right? I'm very pro-expert. I've talked a lot about the balance between experts and democracy and the public, but we can't just kind of give up decision-making to experts, right? for a lot of different reasons, but primarily if you go back to the wicked problem slide, we have experts in all the boxes, but there's no experts to tell us how to rank the boxes, right? Experts really struggle with values, particularly value dilemmas. So a lot of our processes, before the process, during the process, after the process, we're constantly weaving together kind of the publics and experts. We need fact checking sometimes, right? We need to know what works and what doesn't work. We need to know what the literature says about things, right? But in the heart of it, most of our decisions about wicked problems, boils down to making some tough value judgments, and we can't, let the experts make those judgments for us, right? But how do we think more deeply about the role of experts and who's considered an expert? Right? All right. So now, where am I? Okay, I'm gonna try to finish this. We have 30 minutes for Q&A here. The hopeful news, more and more we're realizing again, once we recognize we're looking at the world through a wicked problems lens, and we understand how our brains work and how so many of our processes don't, we can start making those kind of changes. And one thing I'll say from the beginning, because we've got a couple of big organizations that are sponsoring this, organizations like the League of Women Voters, right, can be key to this. Communities need these bridging organizations that see themselves in a different role. And it's a challenging role that a lot of my research kind of will tap into in a sense, right? But the model I've been building, hopefully this will be a book by the end of this year, of turning this talk into a book. But these kind of 5 steps that we need to do in our community. The first initial steps are shorter term, more individual, right? So one thing, hopefully, if you've bought my argument so far tonight, you'll be able to adopt what I call a wicked problems mindset, right? So you've already taken the first step potentially if you buy this. So adopting a wicked problem mindset, I've inherently talked about this already, but it's starting with the presumption of wicked problems, not wicked people. And I'll stop here for a second, because I'm not saying there's not wicked people, right? I'm not saying everyone is just fine, right? What I am saying is our brains go to wicked people a lot quicker than it should, right? So we assume we want the problem to be wicked people, like Disney taught us, right? So that's one danger. But there's also a very big pragmatic argument here, because I can tell you clearly from the literature that even if people are wicked, telling wicked people that they're wicked doesn't tend to make them less wicked. There's very few people that self-identify as wicked, right? So when you tell people that they're wicked, they're actually going to react negatively to it, right? They're going to polarize even more. They're going to dismiss you even more. And anything else you say is probably going to be irrelevant or likely to backfire, right? So part of my argument here, if you truly believe that there's wicked people in charge of things, that society, that we need to kind of challenge them and topple them and oppression, and I'm not going to disagree with any of that necessarily, right? I believe the best way to deal with that is to kind of come from a wicked problems lens. I feel pretty confidently that bad faith actors that are in charge love the fact that we're all screaming at each other and facts don't matter. But if we start elevating the conversations and we start kind of changing how we talk about things, all of a sudden that's going to get exposed a lot more, and we'll find better ways of moving the needle on different issues, right? So if you have more of an activist mindset, there's ways of combining this deliberative world with an activist mindset that has a pragmatic way for us to move the needle forward. Second, as an individual, become more comfortable with uncertainty. Recognize your brain wants that simple story and push back on it, right? When you have this situation where you're just so sure you're right and the other side seems so ridiculous, a light should go off. Maybe you're missing something, right? Can you find them? Maybe your brain's playing a trick on you in a sense. So I talk a lot about leadership skills in my work, and old school leadership is these, hey, I can rally the troops, I can kind of fire people up. And that's still important. We still need that in some situations, right? But the reality is in a hyperpolarized environment that we're in right now, and when we're dealing with wicked problems, this kind of traditional leadership fails. This works to mobilize one side, but it also inherently mobilizes opposition. It creates more polarization. It breaks down relationships, and then we can't come together to deal with our shared problems well. Right? So with the leaders of the 21st century, we need to think about leadership differently. The superpower of the leaders that we need are these, right? We need leaders that can bring people together across perspectives to deal with tough issues better. The reality is we elect the people on the left, but we need the people on the right as our leaders, right? The good news though is that impulse is not nearly as strong at the local level. At local level, we realize we need collaborative leaders in lots of different ways. Those people can get elected. At the national level, I can get reelected and reelected and reelected just playing the games of politics, right? Just playing simple narratives, particularly with gerrymandered and so forth, right? At a local level, leaders have to solve problems. And to solve problems, we have to bring people together, right? So how do we make sure we think about leadership differently and develop these skills moving forward, right? Your job from a wicked problems mindset is to not just focus, don't give up on winning the argument. I'm not saying don't care about the argument, but don't focus on winning the argument. Focus on elevating the conversation. Help people have the conversations they need to have, right? And if you're so sure you're right, if you're so sure that your side has much better arguments, if you elevate the conversation, your side's going to have an inherent advantage anyway, right? So everyone has a vested interest. When I talk to experts, you have a vested interest in finding better ways of talking about things, right? Because that's, as we elevate our conversations, now facts matter again, right? And we get past that kind of polarization, right? I've said this several times, so this can be quick, right? So put your energy towards identifying, engaging, and negotiating those tensions. Look for them. Overcome your natural tendency to avoid those or strategically frame things as if they don't exist. Right? And then lastly, what we need to do in our communities is develop a learning community. Since you don't solve wicked problems, since you're never going to find the perfect way to balance all these values, that's not going to change. We need to invest in our communities and build a capacity to be able to have the conversations we need to have, right? And this is across institutions. This is civic society. This is local governments. This is universities. This is high schools. How do we all kind of think about our deliberative system of how we talk about issues in our community, and how do we find ways, not only we naturally kind of focus on taking power away from the bad faith actors and the problem, but we also need to focus proactively on how do we build up positive resources, right? And there's lots of kind of resources out there to kind of think about that, right? So moving forward, how do we change how we engage now, right? And this is the heart of the deliberative perspective, is talking about issues differently. This is an individual skill and also a broader process skill. So earlier I shared with you the bad news about human nature. Here's some of the good stuff that we want to tap into, right? First, this is the flip side that I talked about earlier, is we are inherently social, and we want purpose and we want community. Another great TED Talk that I have a link on the resource page, Daniel Pink book, Drive, really gets into what motivates people and talks a lot about that. We want purpose, we want autonomy, we want mastery. These are positive things we can tap into, right? My ultimate goal in a way is to convince more and more people that, doing diverse democracy well is hard, but it's rewarding and you can get joy from it. Because there is something about human nature that we get joy of doing hard things well. Right? This is the concept that Daniel Pink talks about in terms of mastery, right? So how do we reframe things instead of that easy win of good versus evil and I'm on the right side? How do we train people to do democracy kind of better? And I think, and I've seen that. I've seen the joy and the value that comes out of that. And again, organizations like League of Women Voters can really kind of tap into that, right? Second, we're inherently empathetic. There is a basic aspect of human nature that we do care about each other. There's a huge debate in the literature on empathy, so this is interesting stuff to dig into. Some people warning that we don't rely too much on empathy. Unfortunately, empathy really taps into the us versus them, and we are naturally more empathetic to people that look like us, right? So there is some problems there, but there's ways that we can kind of take this natural empathy and kind of expand it. And I know a lot of the power of our processes is real people talking to each other, seeing their facial expressions, hearing their stories, hearing their emotions, taps into something. It's really hard to hate up close. These caricatures that we build up in our head of making assumptions about the other side can melt away pretty quickly with one tough, real conversation, right? So how do we kind of have conversations that tap into that? Most importantly, the defining feature of our species is we're pragmatic and creative. We're great collaborative problem solvers when asked to be. And this is like the biggest kind of shame of all of this, is we rarely tap into this, right? Because if we have the easier option of the simple good versus evil story, we just go there, right? We just need to vanquish evil. But this is the power when we shift from the easy assumption of wicked people to the more nuanced assumption of wicked problems. We shift from this me against you, face-to-face opponents to now being shoulder to shoulder working the problem. And that's when we tap into human creativity. That's when we tap into the possibility of those transcending conversations or better ways of balancing things. And it's beautiful to watch, right? It's, the favorite part of my job is to see these, and COVID has taken this away, right? Because we still have the same meetings on COVID. We all gather together, but then we send you to small groups to my facilitators. When you're in the small groups, I'm in the room by myself, right? I'm in the main room, like, I don't see anything, right? But walking around when we have in-person events, I just see these aha moments. My students report these moments where students are like, participants are like, I see what you're saying now, right? Where the caricatures and the assumptions get melted away and people all of a sudden start working the problem together, right? How do we create more opportunities for people to have those kind of conversations, right? And then last, I'll say that while the negative stuff is stronger, it's easier to trigger, it's more evolved, the good stuff is still there, and we can build better habits. Individually, we can kind of retrain our brain. In our organizations, we can kind of change the incentives. In our communities, we can build more and more. And I'll share a little bit later in terms of that this is a positive feedback loop. The more we do this work, the easier it is to do, and we build it kind of more and more, right? And one thing so the bottom line here, going back to the danger of the backfire effect, and my point that facts don't change people's minds and often push them in the opposite direction. What we do know from the research, what does change people's minds is genuine conversations, and that people that they've learned to at least have some respect, some mutual understanding. Our public processes do not do that. We need different ways of engaging to create that. So how do we build capacity to do those type of things, right? So earlier I shared with you, most of our processes do this. We need something very different. So the next big stage is, okay, how do we build capacity in our community for these different kind of conversations? So there's a whole literature out there, lots of different fields. They all call it kind of different things. I use the word deliberative engagement, but it's all kind of this common thing of people like having process designers that are thinking about how do we bring people together in more productive ways, right? That we're not just putting people in the same room to have opinions. We're putting a lot of thought into how we do that and how we build that up, right? Overall, what we try to do in the work that we do is these 4 big shifts, which is really the heart of the work that we do that you already heard, that we're shifting from the wicked people to wicked problems, like I mentioned already. Then we're switching from this adversarial mode of seeing each other as enemies, seeing each other as combatants, to seeing each other as collaborators, right? Because we know from the research that when we're in adversarial mode, we bring out the worst in human nature. It's fight or flight, where we're highlighting, where we're lighting up the worst parts of our brain. Whereas when we're in collaborative mode, we have the potential of avoiding the negative and tapping into the positive, right? And particularly for those who really care about facts and data and expertise, when we're in adversarial mode, those things don't matter. They don't work nearly as well as we need them to. When we're in collaborative mode, we seek out good information to make better decisions. And all of a sudden, the facts that we care about matter again, right? So how do we go about working to make those 4 shifts, right? So this is kind of the really starting to get into the nuts and bolts in a way. Obviously, we can't dig too deep in here today, but if this slide in particular, if you want kind of more, I'll give you a couple of different resources. But these are the components of the meetings that we design, the process that we do that we need to do more and more of in our communities, right? And the first thing is what I now call principled impartiality, which is what I do, right? The CPD, when I introduced it earlier today, I said it serves as an impartial resource for the Northern Colorado community. Well, what does impartiality mean, right? And impartiality is getting more and more difficult in hyperpartisanship, right? How can you not pick a side, right? How can you kind of false equivalence or kind of a both sidesism in a way, right? So I had my slide here. Here it is. I went backwards. So this diagram kind of taps into this notion of principled impartiality that we've developed at the CBD. I literally just published about 2 weeks ago or so a new article in National Civic Review that's linked in the resource document if you want to dig into this a little bit more, right? But I make the argument, I defend neutrality, which has kind of been under attack in lots of different ways, but defend it in a particular way. So I talk here that as the director of the CPD, I have a commitment to impartiality. I need people to trust me. I need people to believe I don't have a dog in the fight, right? That I'm focused on the process. But at the same time, I'm not neutral in the sense of I'm detached, right? I'm not neutral in the sense that I don't have any values and I don't care, right? So principled impartiality is I'm committed to impartiality to play that role, and I'm also committed on the bottom right to democracy. And a lot of what comes in with democracy, including equality, including inclusion, including free speech, including pluralism, right? So some tensions within that. So I'm going to violate kind of a pure form of impartiality for the sake of democracy in some important ways to make sure. So in some ways, inherently, I'm anti-oppression, right? Because oppression is anti-democratic. So it brings in some of those things. And then they also, going back to my argumentation days, I care about quality argument, right? If one side has really good information, the other side clearly has misinformation that we know is not true, I don't want to be neutral on that either, right? So a lot of my work is constantly negotiating this tension. And I know journalists are doing this all the time, librarians are doing this all the time, teachers are doing this all the time, League of Women Voters are doing this all the time, right? That you're wanting to play these different roles. And this is a wicked problem. These three things are all good. They don't fit together very well, right? So the work that I do is constantly negotiating the tensions between this. And there's a danger if any of these three dominates too much, right? So a lot of the criticism of neutrality lately, I would frame that as people that are overemphasizing impartiality and forgetting about the other two commitments, right? But if I also give up on impartiality and I decide to kind of pick one side, I'm also losing my power, right? I'm losing my ability to bring people together, right? So one thing I've learned, and I make the case in that article, is local communities need impartial resources. They need bridging institutions. They need organizations that help us have the conversation. If everyone picks a side and we just ultimately hyperpolarize, we're not going to move forward, right? So that's the danger now. As we get polarized, how do you stay impartial in a polarized world? We have to figure out ways of doing that. Right? Then all our processes are framed in a particular way. So how are we bringing people together? What questions are we asking? I use the wicked problems frame there. I try to get away from yes/no issues. We try to engage people before their decisions are made up. We try to kind of implicitly think about a broad range of actors. We don't want to bring people together like, should government do X or not, right? We want to, most of my processes are some form of what should we do about X, with we being the broader community, right? And yes, government is a critical tool of the community, well, one tool among many, right? So how do we spark that more broadly? Most of my processes, the heart of our work is, I talked earlier about how a lot of my work is making sense of the noise, listening to, doing the surveys and listening the one time on the microphone and listening, reading all the message board kind of comments. While I make sense of all that, and then we produce something that we can report back to people what we heard. Documents that are framed to spark conversation, which is a very different kind of document than most, right? So there's a whole art of creating these discussion guides. I'll actually pop in a couple of more resources on that resource guide there's a great little article called Reframing Framing from Public Agenda that gets at the heart of some of these things. Kettering Foundation, kettering.org also has great resources on how to create these discussion guides, right? A lot of my classes, the assignment the students are doing are creating these things. National Issues Forum, NIFI.org, it creates these national discussion guides on issues that fit this, that are designed to help people have better conversations. The next component is we want small groups, right? You can see on the picture on the bottom, this is an actual event that we held here, kind of the student government CSU working with the city council So we got several city council members and city managers in that picture working with students, right? So how do we get small groups that allow you to have the conversations, that allow you to engage issues in different ways? Processes that are designed not just collect input, right? Not just to have one time the microphone, but processes are designed for people to interact with each other, to learn from each other, to have conversations. So instead of this, the one time the microphone that so many of our processes kind of give us, right, which tends to look like this, right? People just kind of yelling from their perspective, which often is basically each side picking a different value, like we did earlier, right, and kind of framing things as that one value. We never recognize the tension between those values. We never work on finding better ways of balancing them because we're just taking all the values one at a time, right? Well, a deliberative process looks like this: citizens talking to each other. They might come with different values, but we inherently, because of the wicked problems frame, because of the process, help them engage those values. And then eventually it's that broader conversation, right? Of what's the role of government here? What can nonprofits do? What can private sectors do? What can we as a community do to address these shared problems better? So this is one of the resources I do already link in that resource kind of page. So National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation, organization that I've done a lot of work with over the years. They have a great 20-page document with a lot of nuts and bolts, like how to do this. They talk about these 4 engagement streams of exploration, conflict transformation, decision-making, collaborative action, several different pages, links to wonderful organizations that give you the tools on how to have these different kind of conversations. Right. So the good news is we know how to do better. We know from process perspective how to have these different conversations and how to set them up. It's just how do we build that toolkit in our community and start kind of providing it to our community, right? Let's skip that for now. And then the last component is deliberative facilitators. This is the magic of the CBD is I have a small army of really sharp undergraduates that are taking coursework to facilitate our processes, right? I work a lot with other communities on, how do you find volunteers to do this? Or some cities going to have a facilitation core across departments, right? But since our brains are not wired to have these conversations, we need help, right? And these components, all these kind of bullet points kind of work together and kind of support each other. Right. But if you have a good overall process, you have small groups, you have a good discussion guide, you have a facilitator, all of a sudden you're having a very different kind of conversation that really impacts people as individuals, also come up with better ideas that have more kind of inherent support for them. Right. I'm just going to skip things here because I want to try to finish it off here in a minute. So this is most of our processes just do that bottom line. Right. That's what we're getting right now. We need to work in our communities to move up this ladder and build more capacity. And how do we tap into our community organizations to do this? Right. So this is part of it. You see the League of Voters on here. We have lots of different institutions and organizations in our community. Some of those are more polarizing. Some of those kind of bring like-minded people together. Some of them are more bridging. They're designed to kind of bring people across perspectives. In the last 20 years, that things kind of have hyperpolarized. So those on the top now are really kind of, bringing people together in bad ways. Those in the middle, which used to be seen as neutral, are now seen more and more as partisan, and in danger in some ways, right? If universities are seen as inherently progressive and inherently kind of tied to social justice, in a lot of ways, they're going to make themselves irrelevant. And we're seeing that, right? Universities have to be these bridging institutions focused on quality argument that I think will get at some of the issues we care about without picking a political side, which is dangerous, right? And then those organizations on the bottom, unfortunately, have been dying off in some ways, right? How do we reinvigorate those? How do we create new ones? How do we build capacity for those? So leadership foundations, League of Women Voters, United Ways, there's a lot of potential there. Some of the best things the CBD has done is created new organizations that serve as these bridging institutions designed to bring people together, not only kind of across left and right, but also across public-private nonprofit lines. Right. Thriving communities are going to be leaderful. They'll have lots of organizations that kind of do this work. Right. And then the last quick point, I won't get into this because I have an article, if you're interested, I have it linked in there, published a couple of years ago. But the long-term thing is, how do we rethink civic engagement? How do we get people starting in elementary school to think differently about what it means to be a citizen? So I make the argument, of wise collaborators being this new ideal that we should really build on and build into our civic education kind of programs, right? So I won't get into that now, but I got a little 5-page paper that makes that argument if that's particularly interesting to you, right? But I'll end with this. This was the bad news earlier, the vicious cycle that makes it harder and harder for us to have the conversations that we need to have and fuels all this. The good news is we know from the research from lots of different communities that there is a counteract to that. There's a virtuous cycle, a positive feedback loop, that the more we give people a real opportunity for authentic engagement to have these conversations, that will lead to more mutual understanding. People will make connections. They might not agree. They might certainly strongly disagree, right? But they understand what they're coming from. They have those aha moments. They realize they don't define people by what they're against. They realize what they're for, right? And that really shifts conversation. I might think what I'm for is better than what you're for, right? But I can see that reasonable people are for what you think. So all of a sudden I can work with you, right? We can collaborate. That starts building trust and respect. That is kind of key for democracies, for communities to kind of thrive. Then that leads to these processes. Instead of just collecting opinions, like I said earlier, it helps us create learning processes that we refine of opinions. So when people come together, they're actually coming up with better ideas rather than kind of making things worse. And that leads to this potential of collaboration and co-creation, which is so critical for our communities to move forward, to move the needle on the issues that we care about. And like I was saying, that this is a positive feedback loop. The more we do this, the easier it is to do. We build up the skills, we build up the knowledge, we build up the connections to do more and more of this, right? So I thought I had this earlier. I didn't want to stop. So if you go on the poll everywhere, I thought I had this up for the last hour, but I'm realizing probably not now. So we'll have that up. We can also just kind of take questions. I see there's some things on the chat. I'll kind of pull that up. I don't know if there's some specific things on here, but we got some time now. Now we've got at least about 20 minutes. I went through a lot more. So yeah, so people can kind of pop questions on there as you see. You'll also be able to kind of do thumbs up and thumbs down if you'd like to. I don't know, Laura, if you've been looking at the chat, if there's things particular that you see that come up.
Yeah, I've been keeping an eye on it, but nothing, no questions for you at the moment.
Okay. So I'm just looking at the chat real quick as people are going to put things, but yeah, so yeah, thank you, Laura. There's that link if you want to kind of look on that, right? So let's look. We got one question in front of us, so I'll dive into this one. Get things out of the way so I can see it. So what do we do when one side's argument is claiming that certain communities doesn't exist or doesn't deserve basic human rights? That is, that would take me back to the kind of principled impartiality, right? That's one of the tougher things. We don't, part of, while I'm impartial on the issue, I am partisan toward democracy, which brings in kind of notions of human rights, right? So there are lines that we need to make, and this gets tougher in a sense that, so we don't want to put people in situations where, we're legitimizing arguments that dehumanize them, right? So these are some issues. So when you think about deliberation, there's certain topics that work really well, and then there's certain topics that are kind of more in this middle ground that sometimes I see the pragmatic value of it, right? So I feel, there's certain been issues, and some of them have been tied to LGBTQ issues. There, I personally feel one side has much stronger argument, right? But do I believe in the process enough that that's going to come out, right? So there is this pragmatic deliberation in a way that sometimes I still feel that deliberation of wicked problems, even though you're dealing with, one side, does have some beliefs that have those problematic, right? Part of me also says, well, for those kind of issues, maybe deliberation is not the key tool, right? Maybe you need kind of something different, right? But I will say, I'll post this in the resource doc too. Just watch this. I think it was a podcast. Simon Sinek, some of y'all might be familiar with him. He has like an optimism kind of podcast, but he talked to an actual Muslim scholar who spent a lot of time talking with white supremacists, right? And I would normally say, hey, white supremacy is is beyond the pale for me, right? I'm not going to work hard to make sure white supremacists show up or so forth. I feel pretty comfortable dismissing their opinion as inherently undemocratic and irrelevant in a way, right? But she actually showed through actually listening and really understanding them that the best way to kind of transform white supremacists is using some of these techniques, right? So there's different, there's not an easy answer to that first question in a way. But I will say, the CBD doesn't take on some of those topics when particularly when there's a strong religious bent. It can be difficult for some of these kind of tools to kind of work, right? Yeah, we've got questions coming in the chat and here, and we can also, if you want, I'll try to have the participant list. We could do the old fashioned, if you want to raise your hand, I'll kind of look at that as well. I think they keep on changing where the hand is, right? But I think if you, is it in the chat, or I guess as host, I don't think I can raise my hand, but I think if you have the participant list, there's a raise hand, or is it now? I think they moved it to the, or the reactions. Yeah, if you click on the bottom kind of tool, if you see reactions, there's a raise hand, and that will pop you to the top of my list. So we can kind of do it in some different ways here for the last 15 minutes or so, right? Someone mentioned Boston there. I've also wondered about the definition of wicked problems. I actually, as a proud papa, I must mention I have a daughter at MIT, right? So I get the wicked kind of problem stuff. I've gone back about 10 years ago. I went back and forth. Do I want to talk about wicked or not? And certainly some people kind of see things differently with that. I finally decided I think it's got enough value when you talk about it, right? But the idea with wicked problems, that label again, is to kind of try to do that shift of, instead of that easy assumption of blaming wicked people, how do you put the wickedness in the problem that leads to those forced shifts I'm kind of talking about, right? In a way, wicked is an easier way to talk about things without specifically kind of labeling some of the isms that people will kind of go from that, right? But it's the overall idea that if you're assuming the problem is caused by bad people, that automatically takes us down a place that, even if that's true, right, I think it gets us stuck, right? So how do we change the conversation to kind of get away from that, right?
Trish asked, is there a strategy for elevating the conversation? How might you suggest to open up the conversation to the values behind different positions?
Yeah, I mean, some of that is, going back to that component, a lot of the kind of work we do, that NCD resource guide has a lot of kind of tools for that. Another TED talk that specifically kind of talks about some of these tools, Monica Guzman, who works with an organization called Braver Angels, that does a lot of really interesting bridging work nationally. She's got a book coming out next month I'm really kind of waiting for. But she really talks about the kind of questions you ask people, right? Because if you ask people, really kind of genuinely ask what they're concerned about, what's important to them, what they hope for, right? You'll get very different answers, but often those answers are reveal people's values. And like I was talking about earlier, in a lot of ways we have the same values, we just rank them differently, right? So that's part of, I often do lots of radio shows like during Thanksgiving, when people are like, how do I talk to my uncle and those type of things, right? And part of my advice for that has always been, if you're going into Thanksgiving trying to transform someone, trying to convince people that they're wrong and you're right, you're going to fail. It's not going to work, and it's not going to be pretty, right? But if you go in to just try to understand them more, right, just to try to ask questions and really kind of listen to them, that taps into human nature in a different way, right? Just showing them that respect, you'll see how quickly the conversation changes. But then also another basic aspect of human nature is reciprocity. When we do something for someone, they tend to do it back, right? So all of a sudden you're opening up space, right? So that's part of it. A lot of what we do, as I talk about civic education in K-12, a lot of what we do in our classes, I mean, it's amazing, of all the years of schooling many of us have done, how often that we've taken classes on how to speak and how to write and how to express ourselves, and those are all important. How many of y'all have taken classes on how to ask good questions? How many of y'all had a significant part of a class or a training that really teaches you how to listen, right? Those are huge, not only democratic skills, those are collaborative problem solving skills that aren't a basic part of our education, right? So learning how to ask good questions. I can, I'll pop other resources on there as these question comes up. I've got a great colleague here that we unfortunately just lost to School of Mines, Elizabeth Parks, who's basically an expert on listening, right? And she's recommended a couple of different books to me about how to ask questions and listening that I can kind of share. But those are the skill sets that you build. And it can be tough with certain situations, right? And we never want to put people in a dangerous situation. But there is the pragmatic reality that that's the way to move forward, right? And unfortunately, well, I'll stop there and we'll kind of jump in a couple of other questions here. And thanks for those that are kind of posting links like Rever Angels. They have really interesting online debates. They do a debate a little bit different than deliberation, but they're still kind of getting at issues in a different way. Let me see this second question here. Is there a phrase or strategy we can use when discussing goes sideways, get heated, emotional? I tend to shut down in conflict and want to find a way to move past. Yeah, there's different. I'm trying to think what's best to kind of go here. I mean, it partly goes back to what I was just talking about, right? Of building, of really asking questions, trying to get people back to a value level. One of my favorite books, I think I probably have the chapter, Fisher and Urey's Getting to Yes. It's kind of like a classic book in conflict resolution for the Harvard negotiation. One of the chapters, if this is interesting to you, shoot me an email. You got my email. I got a PDF of it. Talks about moving from positions to interests, right? And it's really the heart of what I'm talking about here. They talk about this negotiation strategy that people's positions is what they want, right? Like, we need to pay teachers more, or we need to build a wall, or we need to have a mandate, or whatever it is, right? People's positions are pretty set, and pushing back on their positions tends to backfire, right? People's interests are the reason they care about that position, right? So learning how to move from positions to interests, asking people, we train our students to ask what we call probing questions, right? When people have a really strong opinion, like, okay, why is that important to you? Tell me a little bit more about that, right? Tell me what led you to kind of think that way, right? Why do you feel so passionate about, not why do you feel so passionate, but tell me more. So one of our ground rules for CBD events is it's okay to disagree, but disagree with curiosity, not hostility, right? So being truly curious. Monica Guzman's TED Talk that I'll post does a really nice job of how do you use curiosity to really help change those conversations, right? And showing a genuine curiosity, you'll see how quickly kind of people, back off from their kind of strong positions, and all of a sudden you're able to talk to them, right? Whereas attacking them, tends to do the opposite, right? How do you deliberate with someone who's being dishonest, not transparent? That is a tough one. So there are two ways I'll answer this. One is be careful how quickly you make that assumption, right? I worked with a superintendent of a district not here in Northern Colorado that was dealing with a lot of kind of difficult kind of actors. I remember there was like a fake Twitter entity that was like, pretending to be the superintendent that actually had more followers, I think, than the superintendent, right? They actually had an organization that created a newsletter that looked like it was from the school district and somehow printed enough and sent it to a few thousand people, right? So they had some pretty bad actors. So we're trying to work with him on how to deal with that, and it can be tough. Then I ran across him. We were on a panel together 2 years later, and he started talking about his strategies. And he basically said, one of my basic tenets is don't feed the trolls. And as he was talking about it, I started realizing he kind of assumes anyone who disagrees with him is a troll now, right? He too quickly jumped to that assumption of assuming people are dishonest, right? So I'll start there of like, be careful with that. But yes, there are some bad faith actors, right? And luckily, most processes tend to weed those out pretty well. That's part of the heart of a deliberative process. I never like to hand my microphone, in front of 100 people to someone, because that's giving too much power to that. But we've been building a lot of. I had a really sharp graduate student last semester start a project on really how do we think about bad faith actors and what are the techniques that we use for them. Luckily, they're not as prevalent at the local level yet, right? There's a lot of bad faith actors at the national level that get a lot of attention or getting really rich. But yeah, there is something that if they truly are being dishonest, they're not playing by the rules. People are showing up to a process intent on blowing up the process. there's not that many facilitator moves that can change it, right? The good news is part of my process is 100 people show up, we split them up into 15 different tables. Those bad faith actors might ruin the process for 6 people at a table, but they're not going to ruin the overall process, right? And I can tell you from 15 years of doing this, I've rarely dealt with it. I can honestly tell you that, at all our events, I'm never at a table, right? I've got my students facilitating. I'm walking around the room, or now on Zoom, we have these back channel documents that I'm watching. So the students need to, they can say, hey, you need to come to my room, right? Literally, I have had to help a student, I think 3 times in 15 years, that by walking around the room, by either someone's voice getting raised, or my student just non-verbally looking at me like, please don't leave, that I felt the need that I had to, intervene and put myself in a situation, right? So part of the reality is our current processes reward bad faith actors. Quality processes inherently tend to take their power away, right? They don't show up because they know they won't be able to get the microphone and just kind of rant, right? B, if they show up, because of the process, because of the ground rules, because of the small groups, they often just decide not to, kind of spew their thing. Or if they do, it gets shut down pretty quickly, right? Because, people realize, wait a second, that's, we've turned the table, that simple solutions, simple, magic bullets seem naive in a deliberative process. So we kind of cut those, those perspectives down in a way, right? What else we got here? Doesn't look like we have a hand up. There are communities like yours that you think are doing pretty well in holding these deliberative conversations. Yeah, part of the exciting thing, I know Margaret from, she's done work with NIF. I should probably, someone posted NIF. Again, I'll go back through the chat and post those links. So if you keep that document, I'll keep on adding to it. But a National Issues Forum, if you go to that link, this is the one that creates these national discussion guides on things, but they also, have this national network, right? So there's growing national networks. The National Coalition of Dialogue and Deliberation is one of them. NIF kind of has these centers like mine, so I'm listed on there. So I've had the honor for about 10 years, stopping about 3 years ago, I served on, they had a Centers of Public Life program that actually trained people to start centers, right? So we have quite a few, a lot of these are tied to universities, particularly the ones I worked with, but others didn't. It's like, different examples. There's the center, what's the West Virginia Center for Civic Life is one that's been doing kind of great work for years. Kansas State University has an Institute for Civic Discourse and Democracy that does some really kind of cool work. I was to say, the city of Longmont, I don't know if any of y'all from Longmont, but city government there takes engagement really seriously. They brought me down several times for trainings. They have to do other trainings, so there's individual communities. Fort Collins is the city and the county take deliberation kind of seriously. So you're seeing more and more pockets. Colorado is actually a hotbed for this in a lot of different ways, right? The National Civic League is hosted here in Denver. We've got a lot of, really well-known conflict resolution kind of firms. But yeah, you're seeing more and more kind of examples. If people really want examples of some of these cities, I know the National Civic League did a series of individual kind of communities, Fort Collins being one of them that they did a series on, of really looking at, communities that have built this capacity, right? And so we got lots of good news kind of out there that we're going to tap into and examples to build on. Going back to see if there's something I missed or.
No, I don't see a whole lot that we haven't covered. There were some great questions, and it's 7:26. Do you want to take some more questions or kind of wrap things up?
Yeah.
If everyone notices, Beth, the executive director, put both her and my contact information in the chat. So please reach out to us if we can be helpful for any reason. And Martin, this was fantastic. I'm so grateful that you were able to do this with us today. You fit a ton of amazing information in those 2 hours. So a huge, full of gratitude. Thank you for your work to do that for us. It was really lovely to have you. And I will be putting my name at the top of the wait list for your book on this whenever that happens, because this is useful for all of us. And I'm really, really grateful. And yes, thanks to Zonta Club for partnering with us on this. It was great to have every single one of you. Thank you for coming and for asking great questions. Yeah, and we've been recording it, so we'll make that available on our YouTube channel, on the LWVCO YouTube channel. And Martin, is there anything you want to say in closing?
Yeah, like I said earlier, I hope this is the beginning of a conversation. So tying those resources, the more and more people that we have that see their view, that take that wicked problems mindset, right? That take it as part of their work of helping elevate conversations versus just winning the argument. The more I think we'll start building capacity in our local communities, right? So I'm excited to hear from you. I guess the last thing I'll also say is I hope I like to believe that I have intellectual humility, right? And I completely believe, I don't have it all figured out. This is a constant experiment. We're constantly getting better, right? So obviously I love the kudos and people that liked it, right? But for those that are not too sure or want to push back, right? I'm happy to get your email, right? Constructive criticism and thinking about holes and thinking about tough questions. I know, particularly with some of those issues, we've really worked to really think about this interconnection between kind of more of an activist perspective and deliberation. While I push back a lot on false polarization, I also kind of recognize the opposite. I'm not arguing for the opposite of a false harmony of pretending that we're all, that there aren't real issues, right? So we're trying to negotiate this tough middle ground kind of between those things, right? And bring together the best of social movements and activism and the best of deliberation in some important ways. So particularly if you have much more of an activist perspective, we're really kind of thinking through how do we bring these worlds together in productive ways. I'd be happy to kind of hear from you. Right? I know we do have a hand up. We probably don't have time for that, but Trish, you got my email. I'm happy to kind of try to answer that by email as we go. But yeah, thank you very much for your time and kind of sticking with me. And I hope to continue this conversation.
Thank you so much, Martin. You're amazing. We're very grateful. All right, everybody, have a great night.
So save the chat. And I guess what we'll be able to do when we post it on YouTube, I can post the links to the PDF and to the resource document onto the comments, right? So that way, if people didn't keep that link.
Absolutely, yeah. When we post it on YouTube, we can put the links in the the description of the video.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That was astounding, just so you know. My BA is in communication studies from like a tiny little liberal arts college in Iowa, sort of where I'm from. So I've dived into some of this in the past, but that was just like astounding, man. That was really good and so useful and so necessary. And Beth and I are both fired up and ready to take your work and infuse our own work with some of these lessons.
That's great. That's great to hear. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. All right. I think we can wrap up. Thank you so much, Martin.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.